Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Veg Networking Canada. We're going to start with our land acknowledgement as we always do. It's important to honor, respect, and acknowledge that many of us are placed in the traditional unceded territories of many Indigenous peoples of Canada. Welcome to another episode of Veg Networking Canada, where vegan plant-based companies connect and collaborate. We have a very, very interesting guest with us today with an academic background in neuroscience and animal behavior, on a mission to replace animals as a best practice for science, passionate about education and policy reform, currently working on national legislation for animal-based science. She is a 10-year instructor at the University of British Columbia and a TEDx SFU speaker. Veg Networking Canada is pleased to introduce co-founder and executive director of Society for Humane Science. Welcome, Dr. Elisabeth Ormandy.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, listen, we're so happy to have you, and you have a definite unique spin on being in the nonprofit sector. But before we get there, let's start with your own personal vegan origin story.
Yeah, so I guess, just dovetailing off of your own land acknowledgement, I will specifically say that I'm joining you today from the unceded ancestral lands of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam nations, because I'm here in Vancouver. And my vegan origin story, a lot of people have like a vegan anniversary, like a day that they decided, and then it was just quote unquote cold turkey from there. I don't really have that. When I was younger, I loved animals, and I actually didn't like the taste of meat. And so quite early on in my life, I just decided I just wasn't going to eat it anymore. And it didn't come from any kind of deeper place than just not liking it at first. And then in my early years of high school, I met a couple of friends who were more into kind of animal rights stuff, and they were hunt saboteurs on the side. And I watched some awful videos about factory farming, and it kind of just solidified the decision to now come from an ethical place, to not eat meat. And then, so I was vegetarian for a long time. And then, over the course of the last, I would say, 15 or so years, just made decisions to cut things out as I went. And so I don't have like a vegan anniversary, but it comes from, for me, just this evolving personal ethic of, we come to realizations. There's that phrase that you can't unsee it once you've seen it. And that has informed my decisions as I go. So that's my vegan origin story. I've also for a long time worked in the field of animal welfare science. And then as I've progressed ethically through that journey, I'm now more on an animal rights, animal ethics side of things. And so that has also played into my personal decision-making as a consumer.
Fabulous. And everybody's so different with their vegan origin story. Yet yours is similar to a lot of special guests that we've had, which is actually encouraging to a lot of folks listening who are on their own journey. And it's one of evolution, like you mentioned. There's no, that cold turkey joke, kind of funny as well.
Sorry.
So nonprofits hold a special place in a lot of people's hearts. And if you talk to anybody like yourself who runs a nonprofit, they are very similar, like twin brothers, twin sisters of a traditional entrepreneur. So with all that being said, what's your entrepreneur spark to start your own nonprofit?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I actually didn't particularly want to start my own nonprofit. Before we founded the Society for Humane Science, I went to other existing organizations with a job description, and I was like, here's my job description. You need an animal research department. So I went to the BCSPCA and Humane Canada specifically, and I was like, here's my job description. Your stakeholders and members and supporters really care about animals in science, and you should hire me. And for whatever reasons, they didn't have capacity. It wasn't part of their evolving strategic plan as an organization. And I remember sitting with some friends and saying, well, what the heck do I do? Do I just found my own organization? And then they were like, well, yeah, I guess. And so the seed was kind of planted. And that was when I was doing a postdoctoral fellowship at UBC at the time, and just getting frustrated with how little real world impact my work was having. So academia is great. It allows you the freedom to think about things in a deeper way, a more concentrated way. There's influence from lots of different ideologies and people. But at the end of the day, it tends to be that you publish your research and then it might just sit on a library shelf. There's this like, this ivory tower where your work is somehow inaccessible to people who might really need it. And so there was like so many factors in founding the nonprofit. And, I come from the UK, where there are a handful of different charities whose direct mission is the replacement of animals in science. And Canada had no registered charity filling that space. We have animal activist groups which play a hugely important role, and some of them are just solely dedicated to kind of, raising awareness about the plight of animals in labs. But Canada had no registered charity, and whether you agree or not that hierarchical, somewhat colonial structure of having registered charitable status is a good or bad thing, it certainly lends credibility when you're looking for research funding. And if you have that entrepreneurial spirit, you're always like, where am I going to get the funding to do all the work that I want to do? And so in 2015, I went to Aphrodite's Cafe with two female friends of mine, and both work in this space. One of them is the executive director of the Association for the Protection of Fur-Bearing Animals. The other is the chief scientific officer of the SPCA. And we, over some vegan pie and chai, talked about what we could get funding for. And we explored the idea of getting a Lush charity pot grant. And we agreed that if we were successful in getting that grant, we would form a nonprofit. And here we are now 6.5 years later, and we're now a registered charity, and the rest is history. But the motivator came from me from just being completely dissatisfied with not making enough real world change, because lab animals are rarely spoken about, even in our animal advocacy world.
Absolutely. Now all I want is Aphrodite's pie and their tofu scramble.
Yes.
But that aside, this is exactly why we said, owners, operators of a nonprofit are twin sisters, twin brothers of entrepreneurs, because you said exactly what a lot of our special guests say, which is, I looked in the marketplace, there wasn't what I wanted, so I went and created it myself. And that's exactly what you did. So it's very admirable and inspiring at the same time. So in the nonprofit sector, whether you want to drill down specifically for animals and science or not, the third question is, what are some trends in your space?
So trends, I'll start with just trends for animals in science, because that's the world that I really know so intimately. Thankfully, there is a really big trend in non-animal methods in science at the moment. The key is then getting end users to use them and replace the use of animals. So you've got emerging tech and booming business in the for-profit sector, in biomedical industry. Things like organs on a chip technology, 3D bioprinting. There's a local company here called Aspect Biosystems. They're a for-profit startup by grad students from UBC who are biomedical engineers. And they develop 3D bioprinters and also do their own research as well as a for-profit enterprise. And they're hugely successful, and also having really great social impact within the scientific community at the same time. And so it's kind of that beautiful marriage of kind of, yes, we're for profit, but we're also having a great social impact. So those are some great trends in the kind of, the overlap between the nonprofit and for-profit with non-animal methods development, implementation. I think that, if we look more broadly at animal advocacy sector, as a whole, there are some important trends that are happening, and it's thanks to a lot of public mobilization. So there's a lot of legal change for animals, which is really impressive because it's so hard to get. But when you think about what we saw in the past couple of years with like the cetaceans in captivity bill, like it's a national ban on the keeping of cetaceans in captivity. We now have the whale sanctuary that opened in Nova Scotia. There's, the bestiality laws were adjusted. So we're seeing a lot of really positive political will for positive change for animals on a legislative level. And that makes me really hopeful for the future of animals in science, because we have no law for animals in science in Canada. We have a non-profit agency themselves that oversee the use of animals in science, but they're peer-based and don't really have any teeth, so to speak. And so one of the things that I'm working on is pushing for legislative reform, and seeing that trend in other animal industries shows me that we can be successful in this strategy of legal reform. Yeah.
It's amazing to hear that trend from somebody with your experience, talking about how on a legislative level we're moving towards acknowledging sentience and personhood and guardianship instead of ownership, and all of these lovely, amazing things. And you're right, it's mind-boggling that there is no laws for the world that you're in right now, and amazing that that change is probably, hopefully, coming soon. Mm-hmm. So speaking of the future, where is society for humane science going in the next 1 year, 5 year, 10 years?
Mm-hmm. So 2022 will certainly be dedicated to policy reform, simply because we want to capitalize on the momentum, and the newly elected Liberal government have made some solid commitments that are very relevant to us, like passing the Cruelty-Free Cosmetics Act. We are actively going to be holding them responsible for that commitment. They have made a commitment to ending the use of animals in toxicity testing by 2035. We're working with them on the reform of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act as a solid example, so that bill will be amended to include specific language about requiring the replacement of animals with non-animal methods for toxicity testing. So that's one lever, the existing lever that we can pull to make sure they're held accountable to that promise. And then next year, we're also going to be publishing a white paper where we have outlined the shortcomings of our current oversight system for animals in science, and we're proposing federal legislation. So it's kind of a watch this space year on policy stuff. In the far future, I think that these tactics that we use in the short term are part of a broader, longer term strategy of changing science culture, because the current dominant culture of science is to just accept the use of animals without question, to assume that animals are the gold standard in science. So our longer term kind of overarching strategy is to do whatever we can to change science culture so that that is not the prevailing paradigm anymore. It's a much longer journey to get there. But there's emerging evidence, for example, just in biomedical research, that 95% of drugs tested in animals fail in human clinical trials. So when we all know somebody who has been affected by something like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, stroke, heart disease, these things that really deeply affect us and our families. And so I think just, changing the paradigm so that the focus is not on animal models that are failing, but instead is on 21st century science that can get us the answers and the new treatments that we need is our way out of this particular problem right now. Honestly, my ultimate goal is to put myself out of business, which is not very entrepreneurial, but there's some issues where I'm like, oh, I don't want to talk about this anymore. I want it to be done so I can move on to other things. And so hopefully in 30 years time, an organization like ours just simply doesn't need to exist. Yeah.
It's incredible. And I know that I'm not the only one that gets goosebumps when you start talking about strategy and all those different paradigm shifts, because as you're saying what you're saying in the space that you're in, the same could be said for food, right? Is when you think of food, get to a place where it doesn't even include animals. So when you think of science or experiments, you get to a place where you don't even think of animals. So that's really, really fascinating. All right, so this is an interesting one because we don't really have many nonprofits come on Veg Networking Canada, but we do focus on asking a question around supporting charitable organizations. So since you are a charitable organization, obviously you support, but to spin the question, are there any collaborations with other charitable organizations or anything that you want to talk about?
Yeah, we are actively collaborating with Animal Justice, Humane Canada, Humane Society International, and the Canadian Centre for Alternatives to Animal Methods. They are intellectual partners with us on many things, as well as collaborative partners on things like, we just have a memorandum of understanding between our organizations that it is, yes, there's an entrepreneurial spirit, and we all want our own organizations to do well and to be richly funded, but it really doesn't serve animals if we are competitive with each other. The scarcity mindset is something that is really damaging in our sector. And so by coming together and actually being a united force and pulling people in a direction without splintering our side, it's the only way that we're going to make effective change, I think. And so we've got some really healthy, productive, collaborative relationships that have already been built and we're actively working on. And it's just actually really remarkable to be working with those groups that have been around for much longer than we have. They've got bigger supporter lists and all of those things, but they're so generous with their mentorship and their time, and just love working with them. So yeah, those are our kind of, what would you call it? I was going to say our band of brothers, but we're actually all women. So our
Strategic alliance.
It's our sisterhood.
Yes, your strategic sisterhood alliance, and those are some heavy hitters. Those are some heavy hitters, and again, incredible, because that's like another trend for sure in a lot of areas, is that whole collaboration over competition. And I speak to so many nonprofits, and they struggle, and I always think, there's 7 of you that are telling me the same thing. Imagine if you all came together, what you would be able to achieve. So that's really, really great coming from you. Okay, so from a nonprofit, entrepreneurial spirit is a word that you've mentioned a bunch so far. So looking at it from that lens, are there any books, podcasts, or apps that you would recommend?
Yeah, so not necessarily to do with veganism in terms of consumerism of animals, but if we extend veganism to mean that you do the least amount of harm for your organization, I am a huge fan of a book called Dare to Lead by Brene Brown, and just creating cultural safety plans for your organization and all of those kinds of things that she mentions. Being, she has this little mantra that clear is kind. So I love that book and the podcast that accompanies it, along with Unlocking Us, which is another great podcast by her. But in terms of how my work life is served, Dare to Lead is amazing. For others in the nonprofit space, there's an amazing woman called Cindy Wagman, who was my fundraising coach for a little while. She works founded the Good Partnership that are based in Toronto, and she co-hosts with Charity Village a podcast called The Small Nonprofit, and it is just amazing. It talks about everything to do with like decolonizing your organization, to sticky board conversations, to fundraising stuff, and how to actually thrive as a very small shop. So the Small Nonprofit podcast is wonderful. And then I actually recently joined the Nonprofit Leadership Lab, and there's a book by Joan Gary called Nonprofit Leadership or something. I can't remember the exact title, but it's just beautiful. Yeah, it's great to get into like roles and responsibilities of actors within the nonprofit space.
I am so excited just knowing that there's going to be folks who are, in the nonprofit space that are going to listen to this and find it such a gold mine. So thank you so much for sharing those resources. Um, you've mentioned your, the sisterhood or the strategic alliances that you have with other groups and organizations. Maybe from a branding standpoint, are there any organizations that inspire what you're doing with Society of Humane Science?
Yes, there are some non-Canadian ones, if I may. So we are huge fans of Animal Free Research UK and an organization called FRAME, which is the Fund for the Replacement of Animals in Medical Experiments, also in the UK. And the initial conception of the Society for Humane Science was very much modeled around those organizations, as well as, RSPCA UK Research Animals Department. And yeah, so those are my go-tos. That's where I was raised. Those are organizations I know well. I've done work shadowing with them. And so that's who we look up to as an organization.
Amazing. Thanks again. All right. So it feels like we just started talking a minute ago, but we're already here at sort of the last question, last conversation starter, which is always prefaced by saying, don't be modest, no wrong answers. But with all that being said, what is some advice that you have for folks in the nonprofit space, whether they're thinking of starting, just started, in the middle, looking near the end of a succession or something? What's some advice that you could give folks?
100%. My main bugbear is when the nonprofit sector is seen as a labor of love. Like, we are talented, experienced, credentialed individuals, and we need to be paid for our time. And so I honestly feel like if you're not running your nonprofit like a business, you're probably not going to survive very long. So this comes on a personal level, being brave enough to negotiate your salary with your board in a fair and constructive way, and having board members be receptive to that. Like, we live in a very expensive city, and if you want to capture the best talent for the roles that you need in your organization, then you need to pay more than $35,000 a year for a full-time position, frankly. So that's my main piece of advice, is like, do the work to get the funding, get the grants, whatever it is that you need to pay people fairly in this sector, and make sure you have decent paid vacation time and benefits packages and all the rest, because we're non-unionized. So do whatever you can to make the perks worth it. And I have an amazing board who are supporting me in that journey as well. So it is a constant conversation. I'm part of the Women's Executive Director Network in Vancouver, and we'll often talk about not overworking yourself, not doing 100-hour work weeks, because there is that labor of love mentality. You need boundaries and you need time for yourself as well, which is hard when it's your calling to do what you do.
Again, incredible, because when I speak to folks, that's kind of what I try and encourage them is, I know you're doing this because you have an amazingly massive heart, but if finance and modeling, financial modeling, business planning isn't your specialty, your advice is get those folks around you who can help you with that. And I know those listening probably have 1,000 questions about even, how do I get a board, or what does it look like to create the right board, or anything like that. So I know that you're going to be a resource for a lot of folks. And the last piece of advice, what I heard is the old adage of, you can't pour from an empty cup. So make sure that you yourself are well taken care of first and foremost. Absolutely incredible, fascinating. I feel like I could, I'm sure everybody else as well feels like we could listen to you talk for hours and hours. Before I tell people where they can find you online and on Instagram, is there anything else that you want to mention, or that maybe we forgot to bring up? The floor is yours.
No, I don't think so, other than, in the advocacy space, a common question is like, oh, the plight of animals in labs, what can I do? You're welcome to sign up for our newsletter to find out. Like, I don't like people spinning their wheels and feeling helpless. So we often will put out specific calls to actions, like write a letter to your MP, sign this petition, like, get involved in certain ways. And so sometimes it can feel like there are blockages there on what you can actually do as an advocate in the vegan space, in the animal advocacy space. but I take part of my responsibility as being providing people with those mechanisms of action so that we can all pull together. So I guess that's what would be my closing message is, if you feel stuck, you're always welcome to contact me, and I'll give you something to do.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for opening yourself up for folks who are trying to make a difference. And it wasn't brought up yet, but for anybody, you can just Google it. You could do it on YouTube. Hashtag Save Ralph, if that's something that you want to watch about why we would want to remove animals from any type of testing and any type of science. It's a really interesting visual to watch for sure. It's nice and quick.
There's also a recent movie, it was just released last week by a really talented local documentary filmmaker called The Medical Illusion, which talks about the failure of animals in biomedical research. It's his website is evotion.ca, but if you just Google The Medical Illusion, it'll come up and it's freely available. It's really insightful.
Brilliant, brilliant. Yeah, I'm sure it's really insightful. All right, folks. Well, if you want to learn more about what Dr. Elisabeth Ormandy is up to at the Society of Humane Science, you can find them on the web, www.for, spelt out, F-O-R, forhumanescience.org. That's www.forhumanescience.org. And on Instagram, it's actually with the number 4, for Humane Science on Instagram at For Humane Science. Dr. Elisabeth, thank you so much for your time and value today. Thank you so much for joining Veg Network in Canada.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been just such a pleasure. And yeah, my email address, if people want it, it's Elisabeth with an S, Elisabeth at for, spelled out F-O-R, forhumanescience.org. And people are very welcome to email and contact me with any follow-up questions.
All right, folks, make sure you take that. And everybody, we'll catch you next time. Thank you so much.